I ended my last lecture with a question. If I know something you don't, how can I tell it to you and get you to believe me? I'm sure you'll agree from personal experience this is a pretty common problem. It can only come up when we have asymmetric information, when one of us knows something that the other one doesn't. The question of how to convey such information, or to ferret out the information known by somebody else, is the topic of today's lecture. The activities go under the rubrics of signaling and screening. Signaling occurs when I know something and I'm trying to convey what I know to you. The flip side of that is screening. Screening doesn't mean putting something behind a screen. It's screening in the sense of screening applicants. You're trying to get me to tip my hand, to reveal what I know, but you don't. You're trying to pick my brains. The methodology of both signaling and screening are the same. You look at the actions that a player takes and hope that they convey something about the information that he or she has. Signals can occur in a lot of forms. You might have heard the famous Sherlock Holmes quotation from the story The Silver Blaze. The police had arrested a man suspected of committing a murder in a horse stable. Holmes was confident that they had the wrong man. He reminded the police detective of the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime. The detective, puzzled, said, "The dog did nothing in the nighttime." "That was the curious incident," replied Holmes. Holmes then pointed out that the dog would have barked when the murderer approached the stable in the night, unless the murderer was someone that the dog knew well. And the suspected man was a complete stranger. Scotland Yard had the wrong man. Here's a great real-world example. A company wanted to establish a hazardous waste disposal site. The nearby community was economically depressed, and the additional jobs and tax revenues to the community would have been a blessing. But there were concerns. Homeowners were worried that property values would plummet if the site were established. The waste company assured the homeowners that no, they took every precaution in their operations. The chance of a negative environmental impact was insignificant. In fact, they said, they were quite confident that due to the economic stimulus, the property values in the area would actually rise. If you lived in the community, would you believe them? Well, they're telling you just what you want to hear. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're lying. And if the claims were true, this would be a great economic opportunity for the town. But the assurances of the company weren't credible. The company would want to tell the townsfolk exactly the same thing, even if the claims weren't true. Now, someone in the town came up with a great proposal. An independent real estate firm would assess the current value of each home in the community. 5 years after the hazardous waste site was built, the company would agree to buy out any of those homeowners who wanted to sell for the price of today's assessment. "Oh, no, we couldn't do that," said the spokesperson. "We'd go broke." Well now, there's a lovely example of screening. Suppose the firm had told the truth when it said that everything would be great, then it would cost them virtually nothing to follow through on the promise. A few residents in a prosperous community want to leave in 5 years? Fine. The company could buy up the houses and easily sell them at higher price, or even absorb the cost. No, the plan was only going to break the company if there were going to be a lot of houses available in 5 years, and the houses weren't going to be worth what they were now. These examples that we've looked at today have been easy in a sense, because with a certain response, you can be pretty much sure of the real state of affairs. But let's go back to the example from the end of the last lecture to see how we can handle cases that are less clear-cut. You'll remember that we ended with a variant of poker, tiny poker. It went like this. To begin, I put $40 on the table and you put $70. We then each get one card dealt from a deck of only 3 cards, with a 1, a 1, and a 2. Each of us looks at our own card. Then I decide whether to quit the game and give you all the money on the table, or to add $70 additional to the pot. If I stay in the game, you look at your card and decide whether to quit the game and give me all that money, or add an additional $30 to the kitty. At that point, we both reveal our cards. Whoever has the 2 gets all the money on the table. If nobody has the 2, then we split the pot evenly, half to you, half to me. You don't need to keep all of those numbers in your head. They just give you this decision tree. I ended my last lecture by scratching my head about how to handle a tree like this. The big problem was the issue of bluffing. If I have a 2, I'll always continue to play, since I'll always win some money. And if I quit with a 2, I'll always lose some money. So, if you have a 2, playing's a dominant strategy. That's true for you too, of course. But how about when I have a 1? I might win if I keep playing, but only if you have a 1 too, and then decide to quit. If I never bluff, you should always fold with a 1. Why? Because if I never bluff, the fact that you get a turn is a credible signal that I have the 2. And if I have a 2, you should fold. But if you're going to fold with a 1, then I should always bluff. This sounds like just the kind of second guessing that we saw in our mixed strategy games. And that's actually the way that we solve games like this. The key is, every sequential game can be recast as a simultaneous game. Saying it another way, if you can represent it in a game tree, you can represent it in a matrix. How? The easiest way to explain this is to go back to the image that I introduced earlier in the course, the image of a strategy library. Each book in the library was a complete strategy. Once that book was selected, you really don't have any other choices to make. You could imagine each game being played out by each player selecting a book from their respective strategy libraries. The book's instructions could then play themselves out until the game was over. This means that you could represent any 2-player game as a matrix. The rows of the matrix would correspond to the books in the first player's strategy library, and the columns of the matrix would correspond to the books in the second player's. So, in our tiny poker, what books are available? What situations could I find myself in? Well, when I look at my hand, I could see a 1 or a 2. Those are the only things that could happen, my 2 information sets. And based on what I see, I have to decide whether to play or fold. So I have 4 strategies. Always play, always fold, play with a 1 but not a 2, or play with a 2 but not a 1. How about you? Well, you too can find yourself in either of 2 situations. If you ever get a turn, it's because I did in fact decide to continue. So your 2 sets are, I look at my hand and see a 1, or I look at my hand and see a 2. And just like me, you're going to have to decide whether to bet or fold in each of those cases. That means that the matrix is going to look like this. There are 16 squares in this matrix, but we can do better than this. As we've already said, it's never sensible for either of us to fold with a 2. Folding with a 2 is dominated by playing. If the game goes to the end and you have a 2, you win everything. If the other person quits, you still win. But if you quit, you lose. Since winning's always better than losing, it's better to play with a 2 than fold with a 2. Okay. Let's look at the matrix. There now. That's more manageable. In filling in the results, there's still one complication. We don't know for sure what will happen when my strategy meets yours, because it depends on where the 2 is. Because of this, the payoffs that we put in this matrix are actually going to be expected, or average payoffs. Let's look at the lower right cell, where both of us always bet. Then the game is going to go all the way to the end, and $110 will be in the kitty. I've contributed $110, and you've contributed $100. What happens then? Well, 1/3 of the time, I'll win, because I have the 2. 1/3 of the time, you'll win, because you have the 2. And 1/3 of the time, nobody has the 2, and so we split the kitty evenly. Okay, let's compute my average payoff. 1/3 of the time, I win and gain your 100. 1/3 of the time, I lose and lose my 110. And the remaining 1/3 of the time, I lose $5. That's because I put in 110 while you put in 100, 10 more than you, so when we split the money, I only get 105 back. Not so good for me. If we both go all the way, then on average, I lose $5. I'll put this in our matrix. Again, note how the presence of chance forced me to change the payoffs to expected payoffs. We can work out the other cells using the same approach. I'll do it for you, and you can verify it if you like. These values really drive home that we really are talking about average payoffs. Obviously, I'm never going to lose $3 1/3 in any given game. But if neither of us is going to keep playing with a 1, which is what the upper left-hand cell says, then I lose my $40 whenever I have a 1, since I fold and you never get a turn. You lose your $70 kitty whenever I have the 2. So the expected payoff to me is 2/3 times -40 plus 1/3 times 70, which works out to -3 1/3, and that's what we put in the matrix. Okay, the matrix is full, and we're now on familiar turf. This is a 2x2 simultaneous game. It's also, obviously, a zero-sum game, since the winnings of one player come from the losses of the other. Let's use our little trick for 2x2 games to find the optimal strategies. Remember, take the difference of the payoffs in one column and write it over top of the other column. The arithmetic's a little ugly. Do the same for the rows. For example, the 2 red payoffs in the bottom row differ by 15, so we write 15 beside the first row. The 2 red payoffs in the top row differ by 10, so we write 10 beside the bottom row. 10 plus 15 is 25, so we divide both the 10 and the 15 by 25 to turn them into probabilities. We'll do the same for the column differences. And we've solved the game of tiny poker. As we know, I should always bet with a 2, but if I have a 1, the bottom row says I should bluff 40% of the time. The rest of the time, I should fold. How about you? Well, like me, you should always bet with a 2, of course, but if you have a 1, and I just bet, you should fold 7/15 of the time, just under half. The rest of the time, you should bet. It only costs you $30, and it means you keep me honest, at least to the extent that it's best for you to do so. You keep me from bluffing too much. So, who does this game favor? Well, we know from our study of mixed strategies that every row and every column that actually get played are going to give us the same expected payoff. That's because we saw that a player only mixes among those options with which they're indifferent. So, let's figure out the average payoff by looking at the bottom row, since the numbers are the easiest there. When I play that row, I get $10 7/15 of the time and lose $5 8/15 of the time. That makes my average payoff 7/15 times 10 plus 8/15 times -5, or 2. That is, on average, if I play my optimal strategy, always bet with a 2 and bluff with a 1 40% of the time, then I'll take you for, on average, $2 a game. More if you sometimes are foolish enough to fold with a 2. This is really the approach that we take with any sequential game with imperfect information. Fortunately, you don't have to do all of this stuff by hand. All of the decision trees that I've shown you so far in this course were created by using a piece of freely distributed software called Gambit. I included the website information for getting the software in the course booklet. Gambit lets you easily represent a game tree or a matrix. It can then do the number crunching needed to find the equilibria of the problem. Gambit will sometimes choke on more complicated problems. What do you want for free? But it does a very nice job with smaller problems. It took my tiny poker problem and solved it in under a second without breaking a sweat. Before we leave tiny poker, I'd like to remind you of a question that we brought up in the first lecture. It was von Neumann's question. Can something so quintessentially human as bluffing be put on a solid mathematical footing? The answer, as we've seen, is yes. In tiny poker, we've seen that I should bluff 40% of the time when I'm holding a 1. And how often I should bluff in a game like this in general would depend on the payoffs. As an example, let's change one aspect of the game only, the size of your last bet. It's currently $30. If you work it out, you'll find that if your last bet is 0, free, then I should never bluff, since it costs you nothing to keep me honest. Between $1 and $60, I should sometimes bluff, and do so with increasing frequency as the size of your last bet goes up. If your bet is $60 or more, it turns out, I should always bluff, and you should always fold with a 1. So, how does all this tie in with what I began with today? The question of signaling. Well, in the tiny poker game, it's very easy for me to credibly signal to you that I have a 1. I can fold. If you see me folding, you can be sure that I have a 1, since it's terrifically stupid to fold with a 2. On the other hand, it's much more difficult for me to credibly signal to you that I have a 2. If I don't fold, there's always a chance that I have a 1 and I'm simply bluffing. Watching to see if I fold gives you some information about what card I'm holding, but it doesn't tell you everything. In fact, if you work out the math, you can determine that if I bet and you have a 1 in your hand, there's a 29% chance that the card that I'm holding is also a 1. But that's really the best you can do. In the language of game theory, tiny poker has a semi-separating equilibrium. When you saw one action on my part, folding, you'd know what type I was. The guy was holding a 1. If you saw the other action, though, my betting, then I could be of either type. A game can also have a separating equilibrium, in which each type takes different actions. Our waste disposal company example was one of those. A company that was telling the truth would agree to the agreement. A company that wasn't would not. Other problems, each type can respond in exactly the same way, so that what they do gives you no information at all. This type of an equilibrium is called a pooling equilibrium. Okay, these have all been examples of screening. In screening, you try to figure out what the other player knows, but you don't. Greek mythology is full of such stories. James Miller and Debbie Felton wrote an article collecting some of them. One of the nice ones deals with the Trojan War. Helen, the most beautiful mortal woman, had many suitors. So to avoid strife, they all pledged to help Helen and whatever man she chose for her husband. The man that was picked ended up being the red-haired Menelaus. And then Helen was kidnapped and carried off to Troy. So Menelaus started calling in debts, recruiting those that swore to help on their voyage and war to recover Helen. Well, not surprisingly, this idea didn't sound like a real winner to Odysseus, one of the men that Helen had passed over. He really didn't want to go to Troy. He had married since his Helen days and now had a bouncing baby boy named Telemachus. Odysseus is almost always referred to in the Iliad as skilled tactician. He was a clever fellow. He was the guy that came up with the Trojan horse idea. So when Odysseus heard that Menelaus and his buddies were coming, he thought about what he could do. It appears that he was less worried about breaking his vow than he was about his fellow Greeks thinking that he was a creep. Well, to be fair, he was given a prophecy that if he went to Troy, he wouldn't get home for 20 years, and all of his friends would be dead. So maybe you can't blame him for wanting to be counted out of this particular expedition. Anyway, Odysseus' solution was to feign insanity. He started plowing his lands in random corkscrews, sowing salt instead of grain, and just generally acting like a lunatic. And when Menelaus and the others arrived and watched his performance, their reactions varied. Some were pretty sure that Odysseus was faking it, but what could you do? If you said to Odysseus to his face that he was shamming, he could just babble and drool on you and then go back to plowing figure eights. So what happens? Well, what happens is that there's one particularly clever guy named Menelaus, a guy named Palamedes, who was almost sure that Odysseus was faking. So Palamedes goes and gets the baby Telemachus, Odysseus' son, and throws him in front of the plow. He cries out something appropriately poetic, "Put aside your deception and come with us." Now, if Odysseus doesn't turn aside, the blade will cut the kid in half. This is a screening game. Nature chooses which type of Odysseus we're dealing with, sane or insane. Odysseus knows which one he is. In the story, he's sane. Palamedes creates a situation where the sane Odysseus will respond differently than an insane one, a separating equilibrium. Either type of Odysseus can continue to plow, but their costs are different. An insane Odysseus will have a minimal cost. He won't even know what he's done. But for the sane Odysseus, killing his son is more costly than going off to war. So, not surprisingly, he stops, and the jig is up. Odysseus goes off to Troy, and it is 20 years before he gets home. Bad luck. You can find examples of signaling in Greek mythology too. When the wine god Dionysus is captured by pirates, they believe him to be a king's son, so they decide to hold him for ransom. They tie him to their mast with strong ropes. Dionysus makes the ropes untie themselves and fall to his feet. Since this is not something that your average mortal man could do, Dionysus has credibly signaled that he's a god. The ship's helmsman realizes this, and he warns his shipmates to honor the god. They didn't, of course. The story ends with Dionysus turning all of them into dolphins, except the helmsman. Important safety tip: never ignore a credible signal from a god. You can think of lots of signaling games in legend and mythology. The Sword of the Stone and the Sword in the Stone can only be drawn by one who is right-wise king born of all England. Assuming that the inscription's credible, Arthur's drawing of the sword signals that he is that king. Signaling occurs in nature too, in interesting ways. Here's one of my favorites. When a cheetah is stalking a Thompson's gazelle in East Africa, there's a chance that the gazelle will do something called stotting. That is, when it sees the cheetah, the gazelle jumps straight up, stiff-legged, in the air. It'll run away after this, but it's clearly made an action that makes it visible to other predators and does nothing to get it further away from the cheetah. What's it doing? A likely explanation is that it's signaling. Cheetahs are very fast, but not distance runners. Gazelles are speedy too, and agile. A gazelle that stots is sending a credible signal. A sick gazelle couldn't jump like this. I'm perfectly healthy. If you chase me, we're both going to waste a lot of calories and you're not going to catch me. So let's not bother. In point of fact, cheetahs often do give up after a gazelle stots. And no gazelle that has stotted and then been chased has ever been seen to be caught by the cheetah. Isn't that wild? Charles Darwin puzzled over why some species, especially the males of the species, would adopt such elaborate ornamentation. The peacock's tail is probably the most obvious example. Others are bright plumage that makes birds easier for predators to see, like cardinals, or complicated nest-building displays, like bowerbirds. The best theory to date about what's really going on was proposed by Ahmad Zahavi. Zahavi proposed that the ornamentation is a deliberate handicap used as a signaling device. It essentially says, I am so fit, such a strong male, such good genes, that I can accept this sizable handicap and still survive. The support for this model has actually been growing over the last 20 years. You think this sounds silly? Let me ask you then, what is the purpose of an ad that simply tells you Coke is it? To inform you? To persuade you? Is there anyone who didn't already know about Coke? Or that didn't know that it would be the appropriate pronoun to use? What the Coca-Cola company does with such commercials is to signal, we're here to stay. We are so strong that we can afford to blow wads of cash on these commercials. A company that was weak or shoddy or about to disappear or not with it wouldn't do it. Here's another business example of signaling, simplified just a bit to make it fit in a lecture. For the next 2 months, you're going to be running a summer groundskeeping business. We'll call you a gardener. There are 2 kinds of gardeners, good ones and bad ones. 3/4 of the gardeners are going to be low quality, 1/4 high quality. Low quality service costs the gardener $300 a month to provide. High quality service costs the gardener $500 a month. But low quality service isn't very good. It's only worth $200 to the customer. High quality service is worth $1,200 a month to the customer. We'll assume that the quality of service provided by a gardener is the same in both months, and that the customer makes a decision each month on whether to employ the gardener. We'll also assume that a gardener can make an introductory offer during the first month to effectively set different prices during the 2 months. What happens? Well, if the potential customer could choose a gardener at random, he could afford to pay 3/4 of $200 plus 1/4 of $1,200, or $450 per month. The trouble is, A high-quality gardener won't work for that. Her expenses are $500 a month, remember. And he doesn't want to hire a low-quality gardener because they're only worth $200. The market for lemons strikes again, this time with a vengeance. Neither kind of gardener can get hired. So is there any way that you can work and make a profit? Yes. You can use your prices to create a separating equilibrium, signaling to the customer that you're high quality. Here's how. Being a low-quality gardener costs $300 a month to do, right? So you set your introductory price at $290. No low-quality gardener is going to do that. It loses them $10 in the first month, and they'll never be rehired in the second one. So you're willing to work for $290, but why would you? Because after the first month, the customer is going to know that you're a high-quality gardener and that your services will be worth $1,200 a month to them. In the second month, you can charge, say, $1,190. So for the 2 months, you make $1,480, which is $480 over your costs. Here's the funny part. The very day that the customer pays you that initial $290, he knows you're high quality and that he's going to hire you for the second month too. But if you offered him a 2-month contract on that day for the $1,480, he wouldn't take it. Why? Because he wouldn't know that you were high quality. Okay, I want to close today's lecture with 2 examples from a movie that has more game theory in it than any other one that I know, The Princess Bride. For those of you who haven't seen it, the movie is a comedy-adventure movie with a wickedly ironic twist. Our first scene is the battle of wits to the death to save the life of the princess, who's kidnapped by the bad guy. Wesley, our hero, has a tube of poisoned powder. The kidnapper, a self-styled mastermind by the name of Vizzini, watches with interest as Wesley takes the 2 wine goblets, turns his back, and pours the poison into the wine. Vizzini has to decide which goblet he wants, and then both will drink from their respective goblets. This is obviously a game of asymmetric information, since Wesley knows where the poison is, and Vizzini doesn't. But it's so simple, Vizzini cries, and then sets into a bewildering display about common knowledge. A clever man would put the poison into his own goblet, because he would know that only a great fool would reach for what he was given. I am not a great fool, so clearly I cannot choose the wine in front of you. But you must have known I was not a great fool. You would have counted on it. And so clearly I cannot choose the wine in front of me. Wesley realizes that Vizzini is trying to screen him. You're trying to trick me into giving away something. It won't work. Well, eventually Vizzini does choose and dies from drinking the poison. It was obvious that he was playing a game of asymmetric information. What he didn't realize was that he was also playing a game of incomplete information. Wesley comes in 2 types, you see, and one of them had built up an immunity to the poison. So this type had a different option available to it, putting the poison in both goblets. Wesley didn't want to be screened by Vizzini, so he used a poker face, signal jamming. Toward the end of the movie, we see another example of this. Wesley has been paralyzed and is we're unsure about whether he can even move. He's lying on the bed of the evil Prince Humperdinck in his bedroom when the prince enters. Now, Humperdinck would have no scruples about killing a helpless Wesley. He's that kind of guy. But a healthy Wesley is more than a match for him. So he wants Wesley to reveal his type. Wesley lies on the bed saying that it's possible he's only lying here because he's too weak to stand up. Or maybe he's perfectly fine, and the prince should surrender before Wesley does unspeakable things to him. Wesley is signal jamming. He's creating a pooling equilibrium where either type of Wesley does the same thing. Humperdinck's choice has to be based on the weighted average of the outcomes of a healthy Wesley and a helpless one. The prince seems to be wavering. Maybe he's just a bit slow at computing expected payoffs. Wesley breaks the deadlock by standing, coming on guard, and resolutely ordering the prince to drop his sword, which Humperdinck does. Wesley then collapses, but it's too late. The prince has been captured, crying, "I knew it! I knew you were bluffing," or the like, which I'm sure you will agree is not credible. What happened? Well, when Wesley stood up, the prince assumed that the game had a separating equilibrium. Wesley standing had signaled that he was actually healthy, and so the prince surrendered. But in fact, the equilibrium was a pooling one. And in the pooling equilibrium, both the strong and weak Wesleys would stand. Ah, if only the bad guys had studied game theory.